Is Yemen's desperate cry for help finally being heard? The U.S. Defense Secretary, his counterpart at the State Department, calling on both sides to lay down their arms. Why now? Has Washington grown tired of supporting an offensive that's killed civilians indiscriminately and left the Arab world's poorest nation facing cholera and starvation? Much of the spearhead for the fight against Iran-aligned Houthi militias is Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the same MBS who's under pressure over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside of the Saudi consulate in Istanbul 4 weeks ago. In Yemen, there is a coalition of Arab states backed by the likes of the US, France, and the UK. But to what degree can we say that it's MBS's war? Could the backlash over Khashoggi prove a turning point for both him and for Yemen? Yemen, where for now the Saudis and their allies are still gearing up for a fresh offensive around the strategic port city of Hodeidah. What will it take to really stop the fighting there? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Yemen and perhaps a Khashoggi effect. Talking about it with us from Washington, former U.S. Ambassador to Yemen, Gerald Firestein. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you today.
Gerald Firestein, Director of the Center for Gulf Affairs at the Middle East Institute, also in the U.S. Capitol. John Glaser, Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
From New York, former U.S. Defense Advisor Yasmin El-Gamal, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And from Sana'a, we welcome back Yemeni journalist Hussein Al-Bukaidi. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, it was remarks in a speech Tuesday before a Washington think tank that caught many by surprise. Clovis Kazali has more.
Much of Yemen has been destroyed by the war that began in 2015. And now Washington, a key player, has set a deadline for peace talks.
30 days from now, we want to see everybody around a peace table based on a ceasefire, based on a pullback from the border, and then based on ceasing dropping of bombs that will permit the special envoy, Martin Griffiths, who's very good, he knows what he's doing, to get them together in Sweden and end this war.
3 hours later, the U.S. Secretary of State outlined specific terms for a ceasefire. Mike Pompeo called for the demilitarization of borders and for all large weapons to be placed under international observation. Washington is part of the Saudi-led coalition fighting the Shiite Houthi rebels backed by Iran. Weakened by its role in the murder of high-profile journalist Jamal Khashoggi, Saudi Arabia now finds itself under increasing pressure from the West. Yemen stands at the brink of famine, with 3/4 of the population in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. Houthi rebels refused last month to attend peace talks in Geneva, arguing there were no guarantees of safe passage for their wounded soldiers. It's now been 2 years since both sides last held peace talks.
Let me begin with you, Gerald Firestein. What prompted Jim Mattis to make those strong statements?
Well, I think it's a combination of things, several of which were mentioned by your correspondents. First, of course, was that Martin Griffiths was here in Washington about a week ago, clearly looking for additional support from the administration in his efforts to try to get some kind of dialogue going again after the failure in Geneva in September. Martin has said that he would like to try again in November, and that was something that he was clearly looking for some assistance on. Secondly, I think that there's been a growing level of frustration here in the U.S. about the stalemate of the conflict that's gone on since the summer of 2016, and I think that there's a desire, particularly on Capitol Hill, to see the conflict end and the U.S. role diminished. And then the third one, as your correspondent pointed out, is the effect of Jamal Khashoggi's murder and the fact that that has, in a sense, crystallized concerns here in the United States about Saudi policy and particularly about the role that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, is playing. So all of those things have come together to put additional pressure on the administration to try to bring the Yemen situation to an end. The other aspect of it, of course, is that undoubtedly within the administration, there's some thought that a successful resolution of the Yemen conflict, in fact, will take some of the pressure off of other elements of the U.S.-Saudi relationship and reduce pressure on the administration to do something more aggressive towards the Saudi leadership.
More aggressive, you mean? All right, we seem to have lost the connection with Gerald Firestein. Apologies for that. We'll try to reconnect. Jasmine El Gamal, your reaction to what you heard from Ambassador Firestein?
I think the ambassador is correct when he says that Washington has gotten to a point of frustration that just we haven't really seen in the past few months. It's been building up and building up slowly over various Saudi actions, like their tantrum against the Canadians and certain domestic moves that they're taking against activists and so on. But really, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was so cold-blooded and so shocking that I think people in Washington and in other Western capitals actually got to the point where they just said, listen, enough is enough. You have to do something to relieve this pressure on you. Help us help you. And the way to do that is by ending the war in Yemen, or at least taking steps to end the war in Yemen, and also trying to reconcile with Qatar and putting that whole mess behind them. So we finally see, I think, the Saudis starting to listen to the international community and to their allies in their U.S. Because they simply see no breathing room and nowhere else to go at this time.
Hussein al-Bukaidi, were you surprised to hear the U.S. Defense Secretary speak in such a blunt fashion, calling for an end to the dropping of the bombs?
I mean, if we look deep, what he said in this statement, he talked about ending Saudi UAE strikes on highly populated area. This means not an end of hostilities. And in return, they want the Houthis to withdraw from the Saudi border to stop all missiles attack and drone attack on Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. From what he says, it seems to be that he wanted to make the conflict only a Yemeni conflict, and he want like to keep guard and to save the Saudi from this conflict by asking the Houthi to withdraw and to stop their missiles. And I think it's really, really silly to expect that someone will give one of the only strong weapons that they have against the Saudi, which is their missiles and their drone strikes on Saudi and United Arab Emirates. And what he should actually have said to end all hostilities in all Yemen, not only highly populated area, because we know that the Saudi-led coalition has bombed for thousands of times, many rural area in Yemen, killing tens of thousands of civilians. It's not only about Sana'a and major city like Hodeidah or Ta'ez. If there is any truce or ceasefire that will come into Yemen, it must be a total ceasefire, or as the former high political council leader in Sana'a, which was assassinated by the Saudi-led coalition several months ago, he has actually put a plan for a ceasefire and said we will stop our ballistic missiles and drones attack on Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates in return of end of all strikes by the Saudi coalition on Yemen. I think this is the only way that the United States actually can help Yemenis to reach peace. And there is one more major, really important thing is Yemeni civilians, the blockade. The United States and many other Western countries, they should actually have pressure on the Saudi to stop their blockade, which only stopping food and medicine coming into Yemen. And we know that weapons is flowing freely toward the Saudi-backed forces and militia, as the Associated Press have said in a report before, that the United Arab Emirates has made agreement with Al-Qaeda and with extremists in the south. They have supported them with weapons, and this is actually what should happen. First, they have to look into Yemeni humanitarian crisis by ending the blockade.
Let me turn now to John Glazer on this. You heard the caller from Hussein al-Bukaidi that what was said in Washington Tuesday doesn't go far enough, and that there should be an end to the blockade.
No, I think that's correct. There's a problem with viewing the Trump administration's recent statements on ending the war in Yemen as some kind of stepping in to mediate between, equal warring parties. That's actually not the situation. The United States has always had the ability to stop the Saudi war in Yemen with the phone call. This was true in the Obama administration. It was true up until this very moment. The Saudis are dependent in this war on U.S. help, U.S. planes, U.S. bombs, U.S. intelligence cooperation, logistics in terms of refueling airplanes as they're flying over Yemen. And we could have stopped the brutality and the war crimes very quickly if we merely used our leverage over the Saudis and told them that if they didn't stop, all that support would be halted.
And as you rightly point out, as you rightly point out, it's not just the Trump administration. This began on Barack Obama's beat. Why haven't they made that phone call?
Well, I think Obama initially wanted to placate the Saudis in their regional agenda so that they wouldn't kick up a storm over the Iran nuclear deal. The Saudis feared after the Iran nuclear deal that the United States would perhaps tilt towards Iran or perhaps take a more standoffish approach towards the region. And so they kind of threw a tantrum and dared the United States to support its efforts in Yemen. And since then, the Trump administration came into office saying, we're going to double down on our traditional allies, particularly Saudi Arabia and Israel, but also many of the other Gulf states, in our effort to squeeze Iran. And so much of this centers around Iran policy. But the reality is that, the Saudis aren't a strategic asset in terms of U.S. interests. In fact, they undermine U.S. interests roughly the same amount that the Iranian regime does. I mean, they say Iran supports proxies in the region that engage in really nasty behavior. So do the Saudis. They say Iran has a, dictatorial regime that abuses its own people, also true in Saudi Arabia, perhaps more so. And, the Saudis are kicking up a lot of destabilizing efforts in the region, from kidnapping the prime minister of Lebanon to a war in Yemen, which has not only caused immense human suffering, but has also bolstered the position of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So the Saudis are not useful in terms of pursuing U.S. interests, and they often undermine U.S. interests. So we should tell them very clearly, we're not going to continue to enable war crimes, and we're going to insist that the blockade be lifted and that humanitarian aid get into Yemen. And yes, we should use our leverage to try and negotiate an end to the war, but we shouldn't ignore our own culpability in this mess.
Gerald Firestein, what is it then that the Saudis have over the Americans? You just heard there John Glazer say how a lot of what Saudi Arabia does is not in U.S. interests. So why is it that administration after administration, Democrat or Republican, still placate the Saudis? Is it over the oil?
Well, I think that you have to recognize a few things here. One is that the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia has been mutually beneficial and has existed really since the end of the Second World War. And it's built around two fundamental principles. One, of course, is global energy security and the role that the Saudis play in ensuring that the oil requirements, not only for the United States, but for the entire world, are met and play their part in promoting global economic prosperity. The second is that we've worked very closely with the Saudis over the years on a number of areas, a number of issues that are, again, central to regional security and stability. We worked together on the conflict in Afghanistan. We worked together in the pushing back Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. We going all the way back to the concerns that we had in the Cold War about Soviet expansionism in the region. So
isn't that overplayed, though? Isn't it overplayed how much the Saudis really help in terms of fighting radicals? Many people in public opinion feel as though the Saudis on that score are part of the problem, not the solution.
Well, we've disagreed with the Saudis over the years on some of these aspects, and there were certainly concerns about the Saudi role, particularly private Saudis, in helping to fund extremism. I would say that over these past 10 years or so, the Saudis have done a lot to try to address some of those problems and to join the U.S. in confronting violent extremism. So their record is better than it was. You're right that it was not great. But I wanted to make another point about the conflict in Yemen in particular, and that is that there's a tendency on the part of many people to conflate the fundamental elements of the conflict versus what is obviously extreme unhappiness with the way that the Saudis have implemented their military campaign and the way the coalition has. But the fact of the matter is that a major reason why we supported the coalition and the Saudis in 2015, and I was part of that decision-making process, is because we fundamentally agreed with the Saudis about the concerns that they were expressing on the situation inside of Yemen. And the fact of the matter is that you had individuals in Yemen who were threatening Saudi Arabia. You had a movement, the Houthis, who attempted to mount a coup d'etat against the legitimate government, which the United States was supporting, and to take over the country by force. The Saudis were concerned about the presence of IRGC and Hezbollah elements inside of Yemen, rightfully so. So are we. They were concerned about the security of their border, rightfully so, and so are we. And they wanted to make sure that there was a government in Sana'a that they could do business with. Those are all legitimate objectives of their part, and therefore it made sense for the United States to support it. Again, the war has gone on far longer than anyone wanted. The humanitarian catastrophe is there. The number of civilian casualties are there. I think that the Trump administration is right to be saying that we want to try to bring this conflict to an end. But it is a civil war. It did start for reasons that were internal to Yemen. The Saudis did not start this conflict.
The Saudis did not start the conflict. Gerald Firestein, we have responsible
for ending it.
We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're wondering if Yemen might be feeling a Khashoggi effect, with the United States seeming to tire of its support for a conflict that has raged for 3 years, a Saudi and Gulf-led bombing campaign, which has brought the country to the brink of starvation. We're talking about it with former U.S. Ambassador to Yemen, Gerald Firestein. He's with the Middle East Institute. Also joining us, John Glazer of the Cato Institute, who's also in Washington, D.C. From New York, former U.S. Defense Advisor Jasmine El-Gamal, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. And from Sana'a, Yemeni journalist Hussein Al-Bukaidi. Hussein, I wanted to ask you, the last time the UN tried to broker peace talks, it was in September. The Houthi delegation never showed, they say, fearing for security reasons. Do you think they'll show at the next date, which is in Sweden next month?
I was about to comment about that, especially the beginning of the report when they said that the Houthi refused to come. We should actually hear what Mr. Griffin has said after the Geneva talk failed. He said we didn't make it, we didn't make condition correct to get the Houthi here, and he said they would love actually to come to the talk. It was about the Saudi-led coalition, as they did. We must remember just during the Kuwait talk, the Saudi-led coalition has refused to allow a Yemeni delegate to come back to Sana'a, and they had to go to Muscat in Oman, and they stayed there for 70 days. So just imagine if the United Nations cannot actually guarantee the safe departure and return of one side, so how can they guarantee any talk in the future? And I believe that in the coming talk, if the United Nation will make it clear to the Saudi that Houthi delegate and Sana'a delegate must go and come back safely to the talk, I think that they are willing to go to talk. They have gone to Dhahran al-Janub in Saudi Arabia. They have gone to Kuwait, which those two countries actually is a part of the war in Yemen. But the Houthi, even though there are many sides in Yemen and in Sana'a who actually attack the Houthi for going to a country which has launched a war against them. And I believe that the Houthi has always tried to do all the best. They have agreed to the 22/16. They have agreed to all the ceasefire that were struck before. But it was the Saudi-led coalition who keep breaking this ceasefire. And the only thing that the Saudi want is to stop missile attack on the Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. And I want to just comment about the former U.S. ambassador to Sana'a when he called what's happening in Yemen. He said it's a civil war, and Saudi did not start this war. I think those kind of statement which comes from U.S. officials is one of the reasons for the Saudi to continue its war campaign and war crime against Yemen, because if you don't consider them as a part, they can do whatever they want. We all remember that the war started on the 26th of March 2015 by the Saudi-led coalition. Houthi forces has not fired a single
but there was fighting before
Saudi
that.
Arabia before. Yeah, but this is, of course, they were fighting inside Yemen. So this was an internal matter. It doesn't matter if they call it, as they say, a coup or it's not a coup. This was internal matter, and Yemen has gone through many war inside Yemen. But the only thing that actually making this war so bad is the Saudi intervention, is the outside intervention. And it's really strange to hear the former U.S. ambassador talking about this. And the United States actually has supported President Sisi in his coup against Morsi. So it doesn't matter that if any coup in other country, you should not interfere, because what the Saudi did is actually having this blockade that affect mainly Yemeni. The Houthi are upgrading their missiles. They have plenty of missiles from the former Yemeni regime, and this conflict is actually only destroying Yemeni infrastructure and Yemeni civilians.
John Glazer, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I agree with my colleague who just spoke about the problems with the way the ambassador laid out the issue. He also called the preceding Yemeni government the legitimate government of Yemen. That's a bit of a stretch. I mean, he was handpicked by the United States and the Saudis after the ouster of President Saleh, and he was the only candidate on the ballot. To describe that as a legitimate government is somewhat problematic. The Saudis are interested in having a client proxy regime in Sana'a, and when they didn't get that, they started to bomb innocent civilians relentlessly. There's no reason for us to continue to back them in this war, and to the extent that we continue to do so while depicting ourselves as some kind of non-committed mediator, I think that's problematic. Look, the Saudis may have helped us carry out certain policies in the region over the past 30 years, but that is a separate issue of whether or not they're useful for U.S. interests. In other words, our strategy in the region, I think, has been counter to U.S. interests and destructive of stability and all kinds of things. The Saudis are not the oil juggernaut that they used to be. We're far less dependent on Middle East oil than we used to be. You know, an active military presence in the region doesn't do much to secure the free flow of oil. It's in no country's interest in the region to close the Strait of Hormuz or disrupt the oil flow, because they get benefits from having that free flow of oil. You know, there's really no justification for our continued support of Saudi Arabia.
All right, I want to get the panel's reaction to the way that the public opinion is moving when it comes to the war in Yemen on this side of the Atlantic, particularly in the last 4 weeks. After the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, Theresa May in the House of Commons this Wednesday, backing that statement by the U.S. Defense Secretary. French Investigative Weekly, Le Canard Enchaîné reports it's not just the U.S., but also French Special Forces commandos on the ground who call in coordinates to Saudi and UAE bombers that refuel in the air thanks to the U.S. Air Force. Last Friday, on a trip to Bratislava, France's President Emmanuel Macron was asked about Germany's decision to suspend arms sales to Saudi Arabia in the wake of the Khashoggi affair.
It is pure demagoguery to say stop selling weapons. It has nothing to do with the Khashoggi case. What has to do more with arms sales is the situation in Yemen. That is where the situation has to be very closely monitored.
So, Jasmine El Gamal, is it demagoguery to link arms sales to Saudi Arabia to the Khashoggi affair? And your thoughts on the words you heard there from Emmanuel Macron?
Francois, I think I've been fascinated by the discussion so far, and I just wanted to make a couple of points because I feel like it is a little bit simplistic to focus the discussion simply on whether the U.S. has had the ability over the years to stop the war in Yemen or not. I mean, I can tell you, after having worked for 8 years at the Department of Defense, the number of times that I heard people on the outside say, well, the U.S. can stop this with the phone call, is simply not true. That said, I want to sort of delineate the two things that are happening in Yemen, both in Yemen and in the region right now, just to try to focus on the issue of arms sales and whether or not we should stop arms sales over the death of a journalist or over a war in an entire country. The first issue is there's obviously a massive humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and I've been incredibly vocal about the need for the U.S. to be harsher with the Saudis and the Emiratis, by the way, who we still haven't talked about at all on this program, who are a huge component of the war in Yemen. But I've said time and time again that we haven't been as harsh on the humanitarian side, and that is an absolute travesty. And it's something that everybody should agree on, including the parties to the conflict. But when it comes to the actual conflict, I think if we take a step back and look at the region as a whole, without going too deep into it, but starting with the Arab Spring and then both the Iran deal and now the reneging on the Iran deal by the US, alliances and conflicts and rivalries have shifted so much over the last few years. And all of these actors that we have worked with over the last 30 years in the region have been scrambling to figure out their place in this new region. And as a result, we've been scrambling to figure out where we fit in as the United States. And so when it comes to a conflict in Yemen, for example, it's not just the conflict in Yemen in a vacuum that we have to think about when we talk to the Saudis or the Emiratis or anyone else, but it's also about what implications that has for the conflict in Syria and the conflict in Libya and the Saudi-Iranian rivalry in the region. All of those pieces of the puzzle that we have to kind of be aware of as we're making decisions and as we're making ultimatums when it comes to one specific conflict and the other. And this is in no way to say that we shouldn't be harsher with the Saudis. It's just to kind of address the point that my colleague at the Cato Institute is making, that the Saudis are of no use to us at all. It's much more complicated than that. Obviously, you know, I don't mean to sound condescending when I say that, but it's not just a strict, are the Saudis helpful to us in Yemen or not? Are the Saudis helpful to us in Syria or not? But it's a whole range of issues and a whole range of rivalries that we have to maneuver. Not least of which, by the way, not to throw this in at the last minute, but Saudi support for the Trump administration's peace plan between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So lots of issues to unpack over probably a much longer show, but just to make the point that it's not that simple as whether or not we can call the Saudis and just tell them to stop.
And your reaction to the fact that here you have the Chancellor of Germany saying she's suspending arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the President of France saying, no, we're continuing.
I personally think that suspending arms sales to Saudi Arabia has been a long time coming and is long overdue, because they're in Yemen to begin with, but because they're operating with such impunity and they're doing it so badly that I think it is time to stop weapons sales until they can figure out how to actually execute this conflict in a responsible way, if there is such a thing. But in what Macron is saying about stopping weapons sales for the death of Khashoggi, yes, it was a terrible thing, and I think there should be dire consequences for that. But in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really make much sense to stop weapons sales over Khashoggi when we haven't stopped it over the death of millions and millions and millions of civilians in Yemen over the past few years.
Gerald Firestein, you agree?
About stopping arms sales?
Yeah, that it's long overdue.
Not especially, and I disagree. I disagree with your commentators who thought that stopping weapons sales would bring Saudi Arabia or force Saudi Arabia to end the conflict. Saudi Arabia is pursuing its objectives in Yemen because it believes that it is facing an existential threat by allowing the situation in Yemen to continue. And they're not going to stop because of the United States or the UK or France. I think it's easy for Angela Merkel to say that she wants to stop weapons sales because, in fact, Germany hardly sells any weapons to Saudi Arabia to begin with. They don't have the kind of security relationship with Saudi Arabia.
It's second biggest export market for weapons. It's Germany's second biggest export market for weapons.
Yes, but it's still nominal compared to what the U.S., UK, or France sell. So it's not a significant issue for the Germans the way it is for the others. But in any event, we shouldn't be talking about arms sales in monetary terms. Either we sell arms sales because it's in our interest, or because it's not in our, or we don't because it's not in our interest. I happen to think that the United States has benefited over the years by having the close security relationship with the Saudis that we have. And I think that I agree with the previous speaker who said that it shouldn't be based on Jamal Khashoggi. I think that was a terrible incident. I agree entirely with the need to get to the bottom of what happened, and that there should be consequences for those individuals, up to and including the Crown Prince, if they are found to be guilty of being, involved in this murder. I don't have a problem with that, but we need to distinguish between that and the relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is based on our national security interests and always has been. People are talking about for 30 years. It's actually for 75 years. That we have had this close relationship, and it's benefited our country enormously.
All right, lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. This one, a ceasefire will not help the millions of Yemenis who are starving to death. The U.S. government's allowing Saudi Arabia to block food and medical aid to innocent civilians. Shame on us for turning a blind eye to this crisis. We're wondering if there's a turning point with Yemen, and with the fact that the poster child for those who've been on the offensive in this campaign is MBS, is the Crown Prince, and the wonder is whether or not part of that Khashoggi effect might be intrigue at the palace. Now, the New York Times coming out with a report this Wednesday about the king's only surviving full brother, who got into hot water last month when he was seen in a video telling protesters outside his London townhouse that those responsible are the king and the crown prince. He'd been lying low in the UK capital, but now the New York Times reports Prince Ahmed bin Abdulaziz is returned to Saudi Arabia from London. This while last week, Khashoggi's longtime patron, the former Saudi intelligence chief Turki al-Faisal, told the Washington Post he didn't see a changing in the guard from all of this. In fact, he said that the people who think there's going to be any change in the succession are wrong. The more criticism there is of the Crown Prince, the more popular he is in the kingdom. John Glazer, your thoughts?
Yeah, so just since I was rebutted a couple times, I think my colleague at the Atlantic Council and the ambassador have not spent enough time really understanding the costs of our helping Saudi Arabia conduct this bombing campaign in Yemen. We're talking about schools having been bombed. We're talking about hospitals having been bombed. We're talking about a blockade which seems to approximate a policy of deliberate starvation. This is a horrendous humanitarian crisis that we have enabled. And in order for our interest to supersede those kinds of human costs, it needs to be extraordinary. It needs to be crucial for core U.S. security interests. And this quite simply isn't. Our approach to the region has been faulty for a very long time. We've been overly interventionist. And it's just this notion that we need to constantly intervene and meddle in the regional dynamics of this area that justifies our further alliance with Saudi Arabia. So yes, they help us in pushing back against Iran, but it's not clear that that should be a policy of the United States to try and contain Iran actively in the region. In fact, I think that gets us into more trouble than it's worth. Plus, Iran has shown a level of cooperation with us, just as the Saudis have, both with the 2015 JCPOA and also going back to the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Taliban with the Bonn Conference. They have shown and demonstrated a willingness to engage. And at the same time, every allegation against them, against the Iranian regime that justifies U.S. activism in the region, can also be applied to Saudi Arabia. And so the notion that we should pick sides because Saudi Arabia is more of an ally than Iran, or Iran's worse of an enemy than Saudi Arabia, just doesn't make all that sense to me. We need to stop using our alleged leadership of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of the Syrian conflict, of the Iraq war and its aftermath, of Afghanistan, and all of these excessively interventionist policies. We need to stop using those as a justification to continue to double down on outmoded alliances of a Cold War era that are no longer applicable to today's context.
Jasmine El Gamal, again, there's that conference, that UN conference coming up in Sweden next month. Is everybody just going to stake out their usual positions?
I don't know. I don't think anything about the current moment that we're in right now is usual. I think that the conditions are, for many reasons, ripe for some sort of progress. A lot of it has to do with Saudi Arabia overstepping with Jamal Khashoggi and kind of being in this corner where they have to show that they're making some kind of concession and some kind of progress. So I do think that it's a moment of opportunity. And I don't think it's going to be business as usual, Francois. But I also wanted, if you would allow me, I wanted to respond to John on a point that he made, or a couple of points that he made, because I absolutely agree with John on the fact that it hasn't necessarily been the best decision to stick with the Saudis no matter what all the time. And to choose sides and to even believe in that false choice that we have to choose sides in the region between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I absolutely agree with what he said. My point was, in my previous comments when I was sort of laying out the complicated landscape in the region, is that as sort of outside experts, John is at Cato, I'm at the Atlantic Council, we're all trying to make recommendations to these administrations on how to best proceed in the region. And I think that by sort of acknowledging the complications in the region, by acknowledging that Saudi Arabia plays a role on this set of issues that we care about, and that they have their own interests in the region, and only if we can address both our interests and the role that the Saudis play in those interests and the Saudi interests in the region, can we get to a point where we find the levers and the appropriate type and amount of pressure to put on them in order to do something like come to a resolution in Yemen? So I'm not making excuses at all, but I'm just saying the more nuanced and the more sort of open we can be in talking to all of these different issues as we're making recommendations to the administration, the more likely we are to succeed in pushing them or helping them figure out one way or the other how to go about this.
And let's hope there is common ground to end the war in Yemen. I want to thank you so much, Jasmine El-Gamal, for joining us from New York City, Gerald Firestein and John Glazer in Washington, Hussein Al-Bukhari in Sana'a.